I want to dive a little bit deeper into these players moving up fantasy football rankings and figure out, is it deserved? What can we expect going forward? Like, I know we already covered Calvin Ridley in the blow-up game this past week, right? But I felt like we probably needed to look into this a little bit more deeply because I know a lot of people are down in the comment section going, well, Mason, it's all about Zay Jones. Zay Jones is the guy that really unlocks Ridley in this offense. And it's understandable why people feel that way, right? Because going into this past week, you could see that Calvin Ridley averaged about 16.5 points per game in games where Zay Jones played. In the games where Zay Jones did not play, Calvin Ridley was at about 7.5 fantasy points per game. So a legitimate night and day difference here with Zay Jones in this offense. If you're going to look at the games where Zay Jones has played this season, he's played in the Colts game, the Chiefs game, the Bills, and the Titans. Against the Colts, Calvin Ridley, 101 receiving yards and the receiving touchdown. Against the Chiefs, really it's a dud, but he does have 8 targets. Then going up against the Bills, you have a game where you see 8 targets, 122 receiving yards. And now this week, you are actually getting Calvin Ridley with that blow up of about 120 total yards and multiple receiving touchdowns. So Calvin Ridley is a wide receiver 1 in games where Zay Jones plays. In games where Zay Jones misses, you have 40 receiving yards, 38 receiving yards, 30 receiving yards, 5 receiving yards, 83 receiving yards, and 20 receiving yards. So it goes from stud to dud real quickly. Now going over to Trevor Lawrence, you're going to see something very similar as this overall offense is changed as well. In the games where you have Zay Jones playing, Trevor Lawrence, 241 passing yards, 216, 315, 262. In the games with no Zay Jones, you have 279, 207, 181, 204, 298, 185. And I mean, if you're looking at the underlying touchdowns as well, Trevor Lawrence has been significantly better in these games. Now, I wish fantasy football was as easy as finding this one stat and saying, okay, well, we know that Trevor Lawrence will be an elite quarterback, that Calvin Ridley will be a wide receiver 1 as long as Zay Jones stays healthy. But what we get a lot of times in fantasy football is we get these small samples that we have to work with of 3 or 4 games where if you try to extrapolate it out, really, you're going to not find too much success in that a lot of random variance will be brought in with the game of football. So while I agree, based off the data that you are looking at, Calvin Ridley and Trevor Lawrence, they do look more reliable with Zay Jones in this offense being the vertical threat and opening up this offense overall. I don't want to say that Zay Jones is such a difference-making player that he is the only reason why you have these wildly different seasons for these players. I think that it is a combination of Zay Jones making somewhat of a difference and a lot of random variance that we have here in Jacksonville. I'm really hoping that this Jacksonville Jaguars offense is elite going forward, but please don't think that just because Zay Jones is back in, Calvin Ridley is a locked and loaded wide receiver 1 rest of season. Now let's go over and let's look at Courtland Sutton. Sutton is a wide receiver that has been phenomenal over the past 5 weeks. The game against the Chiefs, he gets you the receiving touchdown. Packers touchdown, Chiefs touchdown, Bills touchdown, Vikings touchdown. He's grabbing these balls in the end zone, looking great while doing so, and winning games for the Denver Broncos. And he has been viable in fantasy as well with his just absurd touchdown scoring ability. Now, the question is this more so random variance, or is this something that we can comfortably rely upon season to season, week to week? I think that this is a little more random variance than a lot of people are going to want to assume. Now, keep in mind, I have made a brand on hating on Courtland Sutton. This year, I actually drafted the guy because he was being drafted as a wide receiver 4. Last year, when everybody was calling him the next Cooper Kupp, obviously, he was our number 1 biggest fade. So I know a lot of people hate me talking about Courtland Sutton. They hated it then. They hate it now. But with this being said, ladies and gentlemen, Courtland Sutton has had 8 receiving touchdowns off of 62 total targets. He is representing a, 12, 13, 14, 15% touchdown rate this season. Let me go ahead and just get out this simple calculator so we can figure this out exactly, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, he's at about a 13% touchdown rate. If you look at the other wide receivers at the very top of the NFL that have about as many touchdowns as Courtland Sutton, we're looking at the guys with 7 or more touchdowns. You have Tyreek Hill with 108 targets, almost double Sutton's count. You have Mike Evans with 82. You have Keenan Allen with 113. You have Stephon Diggs with 110. You have Romeo Doubs with 65. And you have Jordan Addison with 72. So you can see Courtland Sutton has a higher touchdown rate than pretty much anybody else here, which does make him an outlier. Now, maybe you want to say, well, Mason, come on, man, he's 6'4". Of course, he's going to score touchdowns at a higher rate than other receivers. Well, let's go through and let's look at if he's ever done this. His year 1, 4 touchdowns off 84 targets. That's like a 5% touchdown rate. Year 2, 6 touchdowns off 124 targets. Another about 5% touchdown rate. Then 2021, 2 touchdowns off of 98 targets, about a 2% touchdown rate. And last season, 2 touchdowns off of 109 targets, about a 1.5% touchdown rate. Now, am I coming out here and saying that Sutton's a wide receiver that you need to pencil in to get down to a 1.5%, 2%, 3%, 5% touchdown rate? No. Sutton can still be above average. He can still be sitting there with a 6, 7% touchdown rate. But from where he stands today, he is going to come crashing down, ladies and gentlemen. If you go over and look at the fantasy points expectation according to PFF, Courtland Sutton right now has 35 points over expectation among wide receivers. This is currently 5th highest. He is alongside Tyreek Hill, DJ Moore, Brandon Aiyuk, AJ Brown, and CeeDee Lamb. Now, with these guys, you can say, oh my gosh, I mean, this is the cream of the crop. These are the best wide receivers in the NFL. Keep in mind, we used this statistic to identify DJ Moore as a sell-high candidate after the Washington game. And the reality of the situation, while I hate to be the wet blanket here, is Courtland Sutton is probably not as talented of a guy as CeeDee Lamb. He's probably not as talented as AJ Brown. The reality of the situation is he's probably just been scoring touchdowns at an unsustainable rate. This will come back down to earth. Sutton could be viewed as a low-end wide receiver 2, but please do not think that he is a wide receiver 1 all of a sudden. Now, let's stay here at the wide receiver position. Let's look at another guy that's at the very top of the NFL with fantasy points over expectation, and let's look at Brandon Aiyuk. Now, with Aiyuk, it's a little bit of a different story, right? Brandon Aiyuk only has 4 touchdowns off of 61 targets. So right now, Brandon Aiyuk's going out there, and he is posting a very reasonable touchdown rate of around 8%. But the difference is Brandon Aiyuk has been absurd with his efficiency from a per target perspective. Brandon Aiyuk currently is sitting with 19.3 yards per reception. This past week of 6 targets, 156 receiving yards, and the receiving touchdown seems nuts. But the reality of the situation is he's kind of been doing this all season, right? And if we were to ask ourselves, okay, well, is this type of production sustainable? The real answer is probably no, right? I mean, right now, if we were going back and looking at the fantasy points over expectation, he's currently number 3 in the NFL. I mean, right ahead of AJ Brown, right behind Tyreek Hill, DJ Moore. This is probably going to come back down to earth just a bit. But based off the offense that he's been playing in, based off how many points there are to go around and the efficiency that we have in this overall offense, I mean, it's hard to get away from Aiyuk consistently being someone that you can pencil in to be a high-end wide receiver 2, low-end wide receiver 1. And it looks like it may not even matter if Deebo Samuel comes back in if he's just going to be this efficient. Aiyuk does play on Thursday, where Underdog has his pick'em at 64.5 receiving yards. Honestly, I probably stay away from this. It looks like he can easily get there against Seattle. But one pick'em I love in the game will be Christian McCaffrey. More than less than half a total yard. I'm going to go with higher. But if you wanted to check out that pick'em, you can find the link in the description in the comment section. Promo code FLOCK, 100% deposit match, plus our rest of season fantasy football rankings and tiers, and that CMC special pick'em. I know Underdog will have some other special pick'ems for y'all for the Thanksgiving games as well. Now, let's go over and let's look at Rachaad White. If we're looking at Rachaad White here, this is a running back that continues to deliver. And right now, he is number 5 in the NFL with expected fantasy points. only behind CMC, Josh Jacobs, Tony Pollard, Alexander Madison. Now, this will be for a full PPR format where the main reason why you have this kind of fantasy points versus expectation is the fact that he is just penciled in to see 4 to 5 targets every single week. This gives him the floor that even when he goes and plays San Francisco, he is still a running back that you can confidently rely upon. I don't think much changes here. I'm probably going to be pushing him up to being a low-end RB1 rest of season from a full PPR perspective, just because there are very few running backs in the NFL that can find this type of receiving volume. Now let's go over to Tank Dell. And with Tank Dell, this is another wide receiver that has been on a crazy streak of touchdowns similar to Courtland Sutton. He has scored 4 receiving touchdowns over the past 3 weeks. And with Dell, this looks more sustainable, to be honest with you, because Dell has had 11 targets, 14 targets, 10 targets in these games. He is playing in one of the best offenses in the NFL at the same time. And right now, Tank Dell is crushing with volume and efficiency. The question that I would have regarding Tank Dell going forward is, what does the target volume look like exactly whenever you decide to go through and bring back Noah Brown from injury, when you add in Nico Collins, and they're all in here together? Because with all these guys healthy, you had that stretch of games in the middle of the season with 3 targets, 4 targets, 4 targets, 7 targets, 4 targets. So, I mean, it is a little concerning that maybe you're going to go through and add in some more wide receiver talent, and that will spread the ball around a little bit more. But with how good Tank Dell's been, you could take 2 to 3 of these targets from him every single week. And instead of him averaging 10, 11 targets per game, if he's out there averaging 8, 9 targets per game, he can still easily be a high-end wide receiver 2 in fantasy for you and still be someone that you're starting every single week. Now, let's go over to Jaylen Warren. And Jaylen Warren is a running back that goes out against the Cleveland Browns, looks phenomenal, 129 rushing yards, and the rushing touchdown off of only 9 carries. You go back to last week, Jaylen Warren, 101 rushing yards, and the rushing touchdown off of only 15 carries. With Jaylen Warren as well, this is a running back that gives you the high floor based off his receiving involvement, where he is looking at about 4 to 5 targets every single week. He's sitting at 42 targets so far this season. So you want to sit here and go, oh my gosh, this guy is dominant as a receiver. This guy is hyper efficient. He's averaging 6.2 yards per carry. It's only a matter of time until this offense just decides to use their best playmaker at this point and really unleashes him. The issue is, it looks like that's not going to happen. I mean, you had Mike Tomlin coming out saying he does not regret giving Jaylen Warren just 12 touches in this game. I have no idea how that is even a possibility, because if you go through and if you look at the fantasy points over expectation for Jaylen Warren here, Jaylen Warren's currently at 21.3. The only running backs ahead of him that have had a large sample to look at are Travis Etienne, Gus Edwards, Brian Robinson, CMC, and Raheem Mostert. So if we look at the running backs with a large sample, Jaylen Warren is about 6th in the NFL in fantasy points over expectation. Whereas you go over and look at Najee Harris with how inefficient Najee Harris has been. Najee Harris is currently about 8.5 points under expectation for his workload. He is just doing less with more than what we have with Jaylen Warren. So I think that Jaylen Warren in a full PPR format probably is going to be a start for us going forward. He's not someone that I can just confidently rank, however, as say like a top 20 option at the position week in and week out. I think he's probably going to be that low-end RB2. Hopefully they continue to expand his role. Hopefully he sees more and more, but it is difficult to know exactly what we're going to get. Now, let's look at Brian Robinson. In that with Brian Robinson, this is back-to-back weeks now where he has been heavily involved as a receiver. Over the past 2 weeks, Brian Robinson has had 13 total receptions. Brian Robinson has had almost 200 receiving yards in the past 2 weeks. I mean, we go through and we look at what we had prior to this. Brian Robinson, 7 receiving yards. 42, 0, 6, 33, 25, 0, 24. Brian Robinson in the first half of the season really wasn't involved as a receiver whatsoever. So the question we need to ask ourselves going forward is, okay, well, will this type of involvement as a pass catcher continue for Brian Robinson? If it does, he's a locked and loaded high-end RB2, low-end RB1. My only concern is if Antonio Gibson does come back, you probably see him going back down to seeing about 3 to 4 targets per game. I mean, maybe even a little bit less. But until you have Gibson back in this offense, Brian Robinson probably will be that low-end RB1 in my rankings, high-end RB2 at the very worst. But I think that's about it for everybody we wanted to talk about. I mean, maybe we can talk about Saquon Barkley. With Barkley, he's going to be good when the Giants can move the ball down the field. When they can't, it'll be gross. You're still starting him every week given the workload, but still. I mean, not much has changed there. But I think that's all I have for y'all. If you enjoyed the video, please go down there, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, of course, if you play fantasy football. And if you wanted to check out any of those pick'ems over on Underdog, if you are saying, Mason, Aiyuk is him, I want more than 64.5 receiving yards, you do you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to be sticking it with the CMC more than less than half a total yard. Going to get that if you use promo code FLOCK on Underdog Fantasy, plus a 100% deposit match. And Underdog will have some additional special pick'ems for Thanksgiving, so please make sure you are taking advantage of it. But thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. I really do appreciate you. I really hope you have a great day, and really hope we get to see you out in the live stream later tonight.